Kia ora tātou, ko Ingelbra te mangao, ko Loon te awa, no roto takiwa ingarangi aho, ko Kyte toko whenua, ko Richard toko ingoa. Kia ora. You'll read in my bio, I hail from the northwest of England, right up by the Scottish border. My family hails from both sides of the border, which was pretty useful depending on who was winning. And my family farm in the Lake District and on the borders, and now my cousin's actually farm in Canada, which shows how people change and move. And in 1988, I emigrated to New Zealand, came to the Bay of Plenty. For those of you who know the Lake District by the Scottish border, it rains a lot. And I came out to the Bay of Plenty and thought I'd come to paradise and met a girl from Southland. So it was back to it, but a great place to live and bring up kids. I suppose in my youth I was brought up quite traditionally. My grandfather was a traditional farmer, and I learnt the skill of dry stone walling and laying hedges. I knew all the bird life. I knew. And then during the 70s and 80s, technology came along, and I saw on a family farm, my uncle, he drained 100 hectares of wetland, and I watched that go in, I remember, and I was only probably 4 or 5 at the time. And the fascinating thing is that land is now back in wetland. And I suppose one of the things I think about when I look at change in New Zealand is those farming practices were built up over 800, 1,000 years. There was a reason for the hedges, there was a reason for the offsets, there was a reason for the wetlands and what they did. And came out to New Zealand, and I suppose we've really had 150 years of development. And the UK and Europe, I suppose they've got the advantage because they know what agriculture and the environment sitting together should look like. And so they've got a plan. So I think that's a challenge that we have. And it's probably, we've got a blank piece of paper. So it's probably a positive as well that we can actually form that together and build that together. But that's one of the challenges we have, and that's the challenges that we're going to have going forward. So Thriving Southland, for those of you who haven't heard about Thriving Southland, it's really, it was brought together by a cross-sectoral group of farmers, and they came from catchment groups. So in about 2012, there was a bit of a drive around catchment groups. Thanks, I think, to the council, and a new regional plan was coming out, and farmers wanted a voice, and then they realised they had to be involved if they wanted to have a voice. So that started with the sector groups, and then it handed over to New Zealand Land Care Trust because, quite interestingly, when you put a DairyNZ sign up, all the sheep farmers would drive past, and when you put a beef and lamb sign up, all the dairy farmers would drive past. So I think stepping back and realising that catchment groups aren't sectoral, they're a community, and NZ Land Care Trust stepped into that space. And then 2018, a group of farmers got together, cross-sectoral farmers, and said, there's got to be a better way forward, because all the regulation was coming at farmers, real negative space, still a bit in that place. And they said, well, let's try and pull together a positive model. So we've got a cross-sectoral board. Jeff Grant's the independent chair. Kyte Scott, some of you may know her from Lampro. And then a cross-sectoral group of farmers who've been involved in catchment groups. It's always great to speak last because Alan's just covered all of this. And, but I suppose the positive view of the farmers was we know going forward we're going to have a lower footprint. We know that and since then we've seen the sustainable finance coming into place, and other things that are going to drive change. Some of you will probably heard of Origin Green. There's some of the thinking around that. I was listening to Mary Shelby, who was an architect of Origin Green, at the weekend, and it's quite an interesting model they've got. It's voluntary. They've got 90% of the processors are signed up. There are some, they use it in the trade space to go out and get trade. So there's some real positives around that, and I know it's not all rainbows and fairy tales and unicorns, but I suppose the idea was, how can we have a positive approach to change? And it's really about, and it's always been about connecting with the ground, connecting with the farmers, and connecting with the communities. So my next slide, and the author of this, the idea behind this came from a talk I heard up at Waiwanaka, and it was somebody who'd worked with the Regional Council, they're probably in this room, and they basically said, the challenge we have is when we look at regulation and where we go, we've got things we need to achieve. So we sit down and we put the recipe up there, we work out what we need in our cake. We then produce this magnificent cake in our minds, and then we deliver the cake to the community, and we say, let us know what you think. And that's no offence to councils. That's because there's a lot of pressure on what's got to be delivered. But in reality, that's community consultation. And Thriving Southland, we work in this place, and it's messy, and everybody wants a say. But at the end of the day, you kind of produce a cake which may not be perfect, but it has the ingredients. There's been trade-offs, there's been discussions, there's been arguments, and there's been the knowledge of where we have to go and what we need to do. And so that's the space that Thriving Southland works, and that's the space that catchment groups work. And catchment groups they've grown and developed, and they're not all about water, because it's not all about water. And that's, I'll help pause that thought, because, and so this is the model we came up with, and one of our coordinators said to me yesterday, the comms, because we had to get comms on board when we first started. I didn't really have a lot of thinking around comms, and I could have taken a lot of driving lessons because people thought we were driving Southland. But then we employed comms, and it's interesting because they can polish things up and make things look great. But actually, the reality is, I said I didn't want the polished slide because it's not easy and it's messy. And but the idea is that you actually put the community, and we're talking about people on the ground, you put them at the centre, and the primary producers at the centre of what you do. So every time you start a project, they're at the centre. We've got a ground-up mantra. It's really easy to move away from that because I've done it. And one of the early lessons we learnt was we came up with a project for some catchment groups, delivered it to them, and they delivered it back with comment. And then so we went back and we said, well, just have a look, pull it to bits and do what you want with it. And they actually, at the end of the day, they pulled it to bits. They used the bits they wanted, and then they threw out the bits they didn't. And at the end of the day, they owned it. So Thriving Southland was funded by the NPI Sustainable Land Use team. And I'll take my hat off to them because there was a lot of kind of friction at the start because it was a bunch of farmers working with NPI, and there were requirements. And then over time, we've built trust, and they allowed us to fund catchment groups with projects, the projects that they wanted to do. And out of that, and I think that's where a lot of our successes come from, that ability to work together. So this is, we consistently go out to our groups and we survey them to the point where the coordinators hate it because they're asking again and again and again. And so we try and think of innovative ways to do that. We have an annual survey. This feedback here, I've given this given a talk around catchment groups at a few other catchment group conferences, and it's fascinating how these are the. I was just hoping there was nobody from a catchment group speaking in front of me because this would have come up. This is what the community are asking for. This is what farmers are asking for. They're asking for on-the-ground support, and we're at a space with social media, and we think we can market change. but actually changes in the kitchen, changes in relationships, changes in talking to people. Somebody asked me what the, what was the biggest thing that had sprung to mind with what I'd learned about in my time with Thriving Southland, and I said, it's the power of a scone. people sitting down, eating, discussing and chatting. When people start eating together, they actually they drop the barriers and they have a genuine discussion. So these are things that we miss because we think we go back to that process, and we get tied up in what we think we need to deliver, and we need to deliver it now, and we've got timelines, and you miss the connection, which actually down the track really hurts because it comes back when the community say, well, that's not we didn't even know you were doing that. The science. So I've heard time and time again, people say when farmers ask for the science, or when people ask for the science, they say, that's just an excuse for not moving. The science is always moving. Just get on with it. Why don't you get on with it? But the reality is nobody actually gives them the science to actually look and understand. The science is there, but it's not down at community level. Cooperation, clarity, and reduce duplication. That's, communities only got so much time, and duplication is something that really annoys and gets under people's skin, and they say, we're paying for this 5 times. So some of the work, in our work, Thriving we're not the specialists, we bring the specialists in. We work with the levy groups, the bodies, the processes, and bring them. So when the catchment group says, this is the area we're looking at, we'll go and help them find those people if they don't have the connections themselves. Local knowledge. So we've done work on the history of Southland. People really want to know where things have come from and where they are today. And funding, obviously funding is always front of mind because it costs to do the research. And if it falls on the catchment group, it means your leaders are always paying the price. So I think funding's a really important area. And this is, at the end of the day, this is what it's all about. It's people sitting down, people sitting around and talking and having the discussion. And I think the cross-sectoral side to catchment groups is really powerful. We've got arable, we've got DU, we've got the dairy, and we've got the beef and sheep, and they all bring different things. The dairy guys are very good at systems, and the sheep and beef guys are looking at the markets and looking how we change things, and they all bring different challenges as well. So this was I suppose this has been the outcome of delivering this information. We started when NZ Landcare Trust, when we took over in Southland from NZ Landcare Trust, they pulled a forum together, so the groups were starting to work together as well, which is really important. And there were 18 groups, and within 3 years of just having the resource to do it, we've been able to, that number has lifted to 35 groups, and a lot of it is about that support. So we have, 5 coordinators, and they're constantly doing the hard yards, but some of the groups will do it themselves, but when they won't, the coordinator will go in and help them. That actually is really, really important, that support, because it means your key people aren't getting burnt out, your key people aren't dropping out, they can keep going. So when they get hold of a project, it's their project, they've come up with the idea, and they really drive it home. And I think when we first started, it was back in the time when wintering was on. It's always on the agenda, but it was really in your face. And MPI, don't know why, but they weren't that popular at the time. And we were funded by MPI, and farmers would come and say, "How can we trust you? How can we trust you? You're working for the government," so, which we were. We were being funded by the government, and my response to them was always, "Well, you can walk away." And they sort of look at you like, "Sorry? Well, you can walk away. You don't have to be in a catchment group. You don't have to run a project." Well, we've had over 80, between 80 and 100 projects now that the catchment groups of all varying sizes, and some are social and engagement, and some are major projects. But we haven't had one catchment group walk away from a project. In fact, they'll ring up worried that they're not on track. because they own it, because they were part of the start of it. They were there at the start and they were there all the way through. And as I say, I come back to quite often we come up with an idea, and I'm bad at that, and my team will say, oh, did anybody talk to the catchment group about it? But as soon as you're on the journey without them, we leave them behind. And actually in rooms like this, it's a real challenge because we're all talking about this all the time. Believe it or not, farmers aren't. They're running businesses, they've got kids, they've got stresses. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And the room moves on. And you leave your community and your farmers behind. And actually, at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be impacted. So it's really important that we get the people on the ground in the room when we're having the conversations. Asking for science, I think I'm a slide behind. So asking for science, a lot of science, really, thanks to Regional Council, they made the science available. There's a LAWA data. So the science is there, but it's not in a way that you can pick it up and read it and go, oh, I get that, I understand that. So we came up with a 164-page report, which good stuff. I think 2 people read it. One of them was me because I had to. But it was understandable. And so we gave that to the catchment. I said, no, we don't want that. We want to know about our place. We want to know what our catchment, what are the challenges here, what are the challenges that belong to us and our catchment, because that's what we want to focus on. And so we pulled all the data apart and pulled out these catchment context pieces of work. Interesting in the science space as well, big call to do water quality testing. And Southland has got a very good network run through the council of water quality testing. A lot of farmers decided that obviously it was wrong. So, and they said, we want to do our own testing. And I made the decision that, no, you can't. And then I got told by the catchment groups that, yes, that's what they were going to do. So we funded some water quality testing. The interesting thing was they then had to make sure that water quality testing aligned with best practice. They then had to take the samples when it was required, and they learnt more about water quality testing than I know. And so engaging people on the ground so they actually understand and they're given the same information that we've got is really, really critical in this space. And most of it aligned. And so they went from, we haven't got a problem, to, we've got a problem. Oh, there's problems in this area. How do we deal with that? What do we need to do in that space? So you're taking people on the journey with you rather than giving them a solution at the end. I think this is one of our problems. We all believe we've got the solution. and there's your farmer looking at the solution, and we're trying to say, why don't they just get on and do it? You know, we've sorted this out, we know what you're doing. But at the other end of the pipe, this is what it looks like. And so we're not just, and as I say, we're not just dealing with water quality. All these challenges that we've got here and things that farmers need to think about over and above farming, today's farming, they've got to thread that together. They've got to make that work. So you might think we've got the water quality solution, but it has an impact on climate or the farm system or biodiversity. So you've got to understand all these things. But that's where catchment groups help, because when they sit down at catchment groups, this is what they talk about. It's about, well, oh, hang on, what about this and what about that? And they start putting it together. And then we've got a lot of farmers, the mental health space that's out there is not great. And it's because a lot of farmers feel quite isolated. And when they come into a catchment group, they suddenly find there's a whole lot of people in the same space. But actually, these guys are talking positively and talking about direction, talking about the challenges. It's not just me. And you can see down the bottom there, I've got financial resilience. And you hear quite often, you know, on this side, you've got farmers saying, oh, you've got to be in the black to be in the green. And on this side, we've got to go, well, without the environment, we've got no business anyway. Both reasonable statements. But out of that, we kind of try to ignore financials. The financial costs of whatever we should do, or the financial outcomes, and people, and you hear that in planning. You hear, well, look, the financials will sort themselves out. It's a bit like me saying to you, in the climate space, the government's now told us that we all need to buy the highest level Tesla, and you might need 2 for your family, and you don't worry about the price. You'll sort that out. It'll happen. You know, the financials are what worry the farmers day to day. They need to know, and when we do the work, it's really important to cost that and look at where it's going. Thank you. So it's really important to look at your financials. And I'm not sure why it is put to one side. It's nearly a dirty word. And it took me a while to go, actually, it's what creates change. It's because even if it's going to be a cost, you can actually look at it and say, well, how am I going to work through this? How long is that going to take, and how do I manage that? So, I suppose that's a key point when any piece of work, you've got to think about, well, how would that link in with other pieces of work, and how does that work together? And again, funding's a challenge, because quite often funding you'll go out and get some funding to do a project, and it's to build a pink house, and halfway through the community will say, actually, it looks like we need a purple house. 2 minutes. so this is some of the work we have been doing with land and water science on the ground. This is funded through AgMart. And I suppose it just reiterates when you put the information in front of the farmers, what starts to happen. This is looking at the nitrous oxide layer within the farm system. How do you mitigate? This farm, obviously, low nitrous oxide, it's a risk profile, so green is not as risky in the nitrous oxide loss. If you want to talk about this afterwards, Clint's there rolling his eyes at me. And on the right-hand side, obviously, higher nitrous oxide loss. Well, when you start talking to the farmers, you start looking at the property, that's a terrace there. And so on top of that terrace, you need to focus on there's a stronger focus on mitigation around fertiliser and farm system. And then here you've got this wetland coming out, and basically this is an aquifer spilling into this drain. The drain was probably put in 100 years ago. That terrace is 45 kilometres long. So from a catchment perspective, around mitigation, putting a wetland across there is a really major positive. Again, we did the work. We looked at farm system, landscape, driven by the landscape, and we're saying, so what are the decreases we can get across the board by not just focusing on one thing, but pulling all the levers, and what are the key issues for this catchment and this farm? Of the two, the farmer was thinking about putting on a wintering barn. The financial cost of that compared to getting probably a better return just by pulling all his levers. Doesn't mean he's not going to put on the barn. It leaves an opportunity. But, there's a 70,000 deficit in his profitability. And this guy probably sat in the top 20% profitability on dairy base. Here's a sheep and beef property. Just whip through these. Same thing. We're looking at the turbidity and sediment loss, and you see these layers, they start overlapping each other. You don't see them, the farmer sees it. On the top of up here, we're looking, you can see where the major risk areas are. Well, actually, that used to be in wetland. And now, so we talked to the farmer, what are your goals, what can you afford? And he says, well, what's the best bang for the buck? So we're going, well, these are the areas you could put in, will give you greatest mitigation. And there's a whole lot of mitigation tools, and Clint's going to talk about them this afternoon. So hopefully I'll flood his workshop. And then finally, this is a piece of work around the Balfour region, and it's a final case study. It's arable, very, very old soils there with not a lot of capacity to hold anything. It's an arable farm, so you start looking at the farm, you split it, and through the middle, sector 3 there, is that's a catchment. There's ephemeral stream right through the middle of this farm. So you start seeing opportunities to what can you do there, what check dams, how can you slow your sediment down. And then in sector 4, that's where all his higher nitrate emissions are coming out into the local stream. So that's an area where you look at a wetland. But the groups have just picked this stuff and run with it. They're just going, this is brilliant. We've known we've had problems, but nobody's told us, nobody's given us the information around solutions. Then I put this up, and I will take a bit of, but this is my favourite project because it was just an idea that was thrown into a catchment group at 10 o'clock at night around, as anybody looked at greenhouse gas emissions across a catchment. That was it. And the group, 3 farmers put their hands up, said, I'm into that, I'm into that, I'm into that. So you think farmers aren't interested. This was in the middle of Haywaka, the debacle, and they pulled, they split up and they pulled support teams around them. And it's about just looking at what could be done in our catchment, what's possible, what could we do in the mitigation space. They were nominated for the Beef and Lamb Awards for the work they've done. They've learnt a lot, and one of the sad things is they had to learn how to deal with negative media. You know, there was a lot of negative media about these guys selling us down the river, and really proud of them. They just handled that. They said, hang on, we're just working out what can be done and what's there and what the possibilities are. So that's my final slide, is when you're working with the community, we all come with an ego, whether we build, because I find I keep having to stand on mine, and we all come believing what the answer, the solution, but the solution is to leave it behind. Having the right people, we quite often say it's too expensive to have people on the ground. I believe it's expensive not to. Building relationships. Change is hard for everyone, and actually it is good fun when it's all going well. So thanks very much, and apologies.